In the ancient town of Ravensbrook, nestled between towering cliffs and the edge of a dense, mysterious forest, the townspeople lived under a shadow, both literal and metaphorical. Every night, when the sun dipped below the horizon, a mist would rise from the depths of the forest, engulfing the town in an eerie twilight. It wasn't just the lack of light that frightened the people, it was the tales that came with the darkness. For as long as anyone could remember, the elders of Ravensbrook had warned of creatures that roamed the shadows after dusk. These weren't mere animals, they said, but beings born from the dark, manifestations of fear, guilt, and despair. They were shapeless, appearing as the deepest fears of those who saw them. Few had survived an encounter with these beings, and those who did were never quite the same afterward. But amidst these tales of terror, there was one story that stood out, a story of a young woman named Elara. Elara was no stranger to the darkness. Her father had been one of the town's bravest men, a protector who would patrol the streets even after the mists had risen. He had been taken by the shadows when Elara was just a child, disappearing one night without a trace. Since then, she had been raised by her grandmother, a stern woman who believed in the old ways and warned Elara never to go out after dark. But Elara wasn't like the other townsfolk. She didn't fear the shadows, at least not in the way they did. She believed there was more to the darkness than just monsters and fear. She believed that her father was still out there, somewhere beyond the veil of mist and shadow, waiting for her to find him. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the familiar fog began to creep into the streets, Elara made her decision. She would venture into the forest, beyond the safety of the town, and find out the truth for herself. With a lantern in hand and a small knife strapped to her side, Elara slipped out of her home and made her way to the forest's edge. As she entered, the mist thickened, swirling around her like a living thing. The trees loomed tall and twisted, their branches intertwining above, blocking out what little light remained from the dying sun. For hours, she wandered, the mist growing denser with each step. Her lantern flickered, casting long, shifting shadows around her. Every now and then, she would hear a rustle or a whisper, but when she turned to look, there was nothing. The air was cold and damp, and a sense of unease settled over her. But Elara pressed on. She had to know what had happened to her father. Just when she thought she might be lost, she came upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, weathered by time and covered in ancient runes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. And there, sitting on the edge of the altar, was a figure cloaked in shadow. Elara's breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, its form shifting and swirling like smoke. It had no distinct features, but its presence was undeniable. It was one of the shadow creatures, just as the elders had described. But Elara didn't run. Instead, she stepped forward, her hand tightening around the hilt of her knife. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. The creature didn't respond at first. It simply watched her, or at least she thought it was watching her. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from all directions at once, it spoke. "I am the shadow of Ravensbrook, the guardian of this forest and its secrets." Elara frowned. "I'm not here for secrets. I'm here for my father. He disappeared years ago, taken by the shadows." "Where is he?" The creature shifted, its form rippling like water. "Many who enter the forest are lost to the shadows, but not all are taken. Some choose to stay." "Choose?" Elara's heart skipped a beat. "You're saying he's alive?" The creature's silence was answer enough. Without another word, Elara took another step forward, her resolve hardening. "Take me to him." For a long moment, the creature said nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised one shadowy hand and pointed to a path that Elara hadn't noticed before, an archway of trees, their branches twisted together like a natural gate. "Follow the path," the creature said. "But know this, once you enter the realm of shadows, there is no turning back. The darkness will test you, as it tested him. Only those who are truly strong of heart can survive." Elara didn't hesitate. She had come too far to turn back now. She stepped through the archway and into a world unlike any she had ever known. The air was thick with shadow, the ground soft and uneven beneath her feet. Shapes moved in the darkness, whispers of creatures that lurked just beyond her sight. But Elara kept her focus on the path ahead. For what felt like hours, she walked, the shadows pressing in around her, growing thicker with each step. And then, just as she thought she might be swallowed by the darkness, she saw a light, faint and distant, but unmistakable. She ran toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she neared the light, she saw him, her father, standing in the center of a small clearing, illuminated by a pale, ethereal glow. "Father," she cried, rushing to him. He turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Elara? How?" Elara spent the following weeks preparing for her next journey into the forest. The town buzzed with gossip about her bravery, and many of the villagers came to her for advice or to share their own stories of strange encounters in the shadows. But as Elara listened to them, she realized something: the shadows seemed to be growing stronger. The mist arrived earlier each night, and it lingered long after dawn. Some villagers claimed to see figures lurking at the edges of their homes, while others spoke of nightmares that felt too real to be mere dreams. Elara's own nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by visions of her father trapped in the heart of the forest, calling out to her for help. One evening, just as the mist began to rise, Elara sat at her grandmother's table, staring into the flickering flame of a single candle. Her grandmother, a wise woman who had lived through the darkest days of Ravensbrook, sat across from her, watching her granddaughter with concern. "You're going back, aren't you?" her grandmother asked, her voice soft but knowing. Elara nodded. "I have to. The shadows are growing stronger, and I need to find a way to stop them. I need to find a way to free him." Her grandmother sighed, her wrinkled hands gripping the edge of the table. "The forest holds many secrets, Elara. Some are too dangerous to uncover. Your father knew that, which is why he chose to stay. I can't just leave him there," Elara said, her voice firm. "He's been protecting the town all this time. It's my turn to help him." Her grandmother looked at her for a long moment, then slowly rose from her chair. She walked to a small chest in the corner of the room and opened it, pulling out a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. She placed it on the table in front of Elara and carefully unwrapped it, revealing an old, intricately carved dagger. "This belonged to your father," her grandmother said. "It's no ordinary weapon. It's forged from the iron of the mountain and blessed by the ancient guardians of the forest. It can cut through the shadows, but only if the wielder's heart is true." Elara stared at the dagger, its blade gleaming in the candlelight. She could feel the weight of her father's legacy in her hands as she picked it up. The hilt was cool to the touch, but a strange warmth spread through her as she held it. "Thank you," Elara whispered, her resolve hardening. Her grandmother smiled sadly. "Be careful, Elara. The shadows are not the only danger in that forest. There are forces older and more powerful than you can imagine. Trust your instincts, but be wary of what you find." The next morning, Elara set out for the forest once again. This time, she was better prepared, armed with her father's dagger, a lantern, and a small pouch of herbs her grandmother had given her to ward off the darker spirits of the woods. As she crossed the threshold into the forest, the mist swirled around her, thicker than before, almost as if the forest itself was aware of her presence. For hours, Elara followed the familiar path that led deeper into the heart of the woods, past the ancient altar where she had first encountered the shadow of Ravensbrook. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of leaves beneath her boots. As she ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the shadows around her seemed to shift and whisper. But Elara did not falter. She knew the forest was testing her, trying to feed on her fears. She kept her thoughts focused on her father, on freeing him from whatever force held him captive in this realm of darkness. After what felt like days, Elara reached a part of the forest she had never seen before. The trees here were massive, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their roots forming intricate webs across the ground. In the center of this dark grove stood a towering black stone, pulsing with a faint, otherworldly light. And there, standing in front of the stone, was her father. Elara's heart leapt in her chest. She rushed toward him, but as she neared, she saw that something was wrong. His form was translucent, as if he was barely there, a ghostly figure tethered to the stone by dark, shadowy tendrils. "Father!" Elara cried, reaching out to him. He turned to her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Elara, you shouldn't have come." "I had to," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I came to free you." Her father shook his head. "The shadows, they've bound me to this place. I can't leave. Not without breaking the curse that holds this forest." "What curse?" Elara asked, her voice trembling. Her father's eyes flickered toward the black stone. "This stone, it's the source of the shadow's power. Long ago, the ancient guardians of the forest sealed a great darkness within it, but over time, the seal has weakened. The shadows you've seen are just fragments of that darkness, se." As the silence of the forest settled around her, Elara knelt by the shattered remnants of the stone, her tears falling softly onto the ground. The weight of her father's sacrifice pressed heavily on her heart, and though the shadows had been banished, the ache of loss remained deep within her. For what felt like an eternity, she stayed there, allowing herself to grieve. The forest, once filled with darkness and terror, now seemed peaceful. The air was still, and the familiar sense of menace that had lingered for generations had lifted. Yet, despite the calm, something tugged at the back of her mind, a feeling that her journey wasn't truly over. After what seemed like hours, Elara slowly rose to her feet. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "There are forces older and more powerful than you can imagine." The stone had been broken, the shadows vanquished, but something about the ancient power of the forest still felt alive. She glanced around the grove, her eyes drawn to the twisted, gnarled trees. Their roots intertwined, forming a pattern she hadn't noticed before. The more she looked, the clearer it became. The trees encircled the black stone's remnants in a deliberate formation, as if they were guardians standing watch over the ancient magic that had been sealed within. Elara approached the nearest tree, her hand grazing its bark. To her surprise, the moment she touched it, a pulse of energy shot through her, not hostile but ancient and strong. A voice, barely a whisper, filled her mind, though it wasn't the cold, menacing voice of the shadows. This was something different, something older, wiser. "The curse is broken, but the forest remains bound. The guardians still watch. They wait for the one who will restore balance." Elara's breath caught. "Restore balance," she murmured aloud, her heart racing. She had thought her task was finished, but now she realized that the broken stone and her father's sacrifice had only been part of the larger story. Determined to uncover the truth, Elara began to explore the grove, searching for clues that might explain the ancient voice. Her lantern flickered in the cool night air, casting long shadows as she circled the area. Finally, at the base of the largest tree, she noticed a strange, faintly glowing inscription etched into the earth, a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. "The heart of the forest lies beyond the veil. Seek the first light, and the way will be revealed." Elara's eyes widened. Beyond the veil, it must be a deeper part of the forest, one that had been hidden or forgotten. She knew instinctively that this was where she needed to go, where the true heart of the forest lay. Without hesitation, she set off deeper into the woods, following a faint trail that seemed to appear as she walked. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it blocked out the sky. The air became cooler, and a strange sense of anticipation filled her. After what felt like hours of walking, Elara reached a place where the trees parted, revealing a small, tranquil glade. In the center of the glade stood a massive oak tree, ancient and majestic, its roots spreading far and wide, glowing faintly with the same light as the inscription. And there, at the base of the oak, was a pool of water, so still and clear that it reflected the stars above, even though the sky was hidden by the canopy. The pool seemed to pulse with life, its waters radiating a soft, calming light. Elara approached the pool, her heart pounding. She knelt beside it, gazing. Elara stood beneath the great oak, feeling the weight of her new role settle upon her. The light of dawn filtered through the leaves, casting a golden hue over the glade. She had been chosen by the forest to maintain the balance between light and shadow, a task that filled her with both pride and uncertainty. As she looked around the glade, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: small creatures, glowing faintly, emerging from the trees. They were the forest's ancient guardians, the spirits her father had spoken of. They hovered around her, their forms shifting like mist, yet their presence felt solid and powerful. One of the guardians, a figure that seemed to be made of shimmering light and shadow entwined, approached her. Its voice was soft but filled with an authority that resonated through the glade. "Elara," it spoke, "you are now the keeper of the balance. The heart of the forest is yours to protect, but it will not be an easy task. The darkness that was sealed within the stone has been weakened, but it has not been destroyed. It will return, and when it does, it will seek to reclaim what it has lost." Elara nodded, gripping the hilt of her father's dagger. "I understand. But I won't let the darkness take this place again. I'll do whatever it takes to protect the forest, and the town." The guardian's form flickered, its eyes glowing brighter for a moment. "Your resolve is strong, but you are not alone in this. The forest will aid you, as will we. But be wary, there are forces beyond even our control. The darkness may attempt to corrupt others, just as it once did to those before you." Elara's heart tightened. She had seen the power of the shadows, how they preyed on fear and despair. But she had also seen the strength that could come from facing them, from standing in the light. "How do I begin?" she asked, her voice steady despite the swirling emotions within her. The guardian gestured toward the pool at the base of the oak. "To truly become the keeper, you must bond with the heart of the forest. The pool holds the essence of the ancient magic that binds this place together. By drinking from it, you will forge a connection to the forest's power, and it will guide you in times of need." Elara hesitated for only a moment. The path had been laid before her, and though it was daunting, she knew this was her destiny. She knelt beside the pool, gazing into its still waters. The reflection that stared back at her no longer looked like the scared girl who had once ventured into the forest out of desperation. She was different now, stronger, braver. With a deep breath, she dipped her hands into the water. It was cool and tingled against her skin, as if alive. She brought the water to her lips and drank. The moment the water touched her tongue, a rush of energy surged through her body. Her vision blurred, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the world around her was spinning. But then, everything sharpened. She could feel the pulse of the forest, the rhythm of life that flowed through every tree, every blade of grass, every creature. Her senses expanded. She could hear the whisper of the wind in the leaves, the quiet hum of the earth beneath her feet. The forest wasn't just alive, it was speaking to her, sharing its secrets, its strength. When she opened her eyes, the guardians were watching her, their forms shimmering with approval. "You are now one with the forest," the lead guardian said. "Its power flows through you. You will feel its needs, its warnings, and its strength when the time comes. But remember, Elara, balance is key. Too much light can blind, and too much shadow can consume. You must walk the path between them." Elara nodded, the weight of her new role settling over her like a cloak. She could feel the connection now, deep within her, as though the very roots of the trees had intertwined with her soul. She was no longer just a daughter of Ravensbrook, she was its protector, its guardian. As the guardians faded back into the forest, leaving her alone in the glade, Elara took a deep breath. She knew her task would not be easy. The darkness would return one day, and when it did, it would be stronger, more desperate. But she also knew that she was ready for it. And after Elara left the forest, returning to the village of Ravensbrook, she felt that she was no longer the same girl who had first entered the woods. Everything around her seemed different, as if the forest itself had granted her a new perspective on life. The sound of the wind in the trees had become a part of her, beating within her heart. When she reached the edge of the village, she noticed that the light mist that had enveloped the village for years had completely disappeared. The sky was clear, and the sun gently shone over the fields. The villagers stood in the squares, gazing at the sky in wonder, also noticing the changes that had occurred in nature around them. Elara entered the village quietly, heading toward her grandmother's house. Some villagers saw her and began to gather around, whispering and wondering what had happened in the forest. Everyone knew that Elara had gone into the forest for the final time to fight the shadows, but they didn't know how she had returned or what had caused such change. "Elara, did you do this?" asked one of the farmers, as children ran around her. Elara smiled gently and said in a calm voice, "The shadows have retreated and will not return. The forest is now at peace, but we must keep its balance." Then Elara walked toward her grandmother's house, where the old woman was waiting at the door. She could tell from her eyes that Elara had come back different. Her grandmother said nothing at first, only opened her arms and welcomed her granddaughter with affection. "You did it, didn't you?" her grandmother asked, her eyes gleaming with pride and sorrow at the same time. Elara nodded. "I've learned a lot, Grandma. There's a delicate balance between light and dark in this world, and I am now part of that balance." Her grandmother sighed with relief, but she knew this was not the end of Elara's story. "The village will always need you, but the forest will call to you too. You are a part of it now." Elara nodded. She knew her life would never be like anyone else's. She was no longer just a village girl, she had become the guardian, the keeper of balance. She was responsible for protecting the forest and the people of Ravensbrook from any future threat. Days and weeks passed, and the village began to recover from the fear they had lived in for years. Over time, stories about Elara spread, the girl who ventured into the dark forest and triumphed over the shadows. Her tale became a legend told to children before bed, a story of bravery, sacrifice, and maintaining the balance between light and darkness. But Elara never forgot what she had learned in the forest. She visited the woods regularly, spoke to the trees, felt the pulse of the earth, and maintained her connection with the ancient guardians who had trusted her. She knew that the balance she had achieved wasn't permanent and that the darkness might try to return one day. But now, she was ready. She wasn't alone, she had the power of the forest and everything she had learned. The future was unknown, but Elara knew she could face any challenge that came her way. And so, her life continued, as guardian of the forest and a source of hope for her village, knowing that the balance she protected was what kept the light and dark in their rightful places. The end. There was a forest on the outskirts of a quiet town, known only to a few as Whispering Woods. Locals avoided it after sunset, claiming it was haunted by spirits that could only be heard, never seen. This forest, dense with twisted trees and a thick fog, swallowed light whole and left visitors disoriented and frightened. One evening, a group of college students, eager for a thrill, decided to spend the night in the woods despite the town's warnings. Armed with flashlights and recording equipment, they ventured deep into the forest, laughing at the absurdity of the local legends. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the forest became eerily silent. No wind, no rustling of leaves, only the sound of their footsteps and nervous chatter. Suddenly, they heard a faint whisper. It was indistinct, like several voices speaking at once. One of them, Sarah, froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others nodded, fear now gripping them. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them. The words were still unclear, but there was no mistaking the malice in the tone. Panic set in, and they began to run. But no matter how fast or far they ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, until they were deafening. One by one, the group disappeared, snatched by invisible hands, their screams lost to the whispers. Only Sarah was left, trembling and sobbing, begging for her life. But the forest had no mercy. The last thing she heard was her name, whispered softly into her ear, before the darkness consumed her. It started with a single shadow. Claire had just moved into an old Victorian house, drawn to its charm and history. The house had been unoccupied for years, but Claire, a writer seeking inspiration, saw it as the perfect retreat. For the first few nights, everything was peaceful. But then, late one night, she saw it, a dark figure standing outside her window. At first, she brushed it off, thinking it was her imagination or the play of light. But night after night, the figure returned, always in the same spot, staring up at her. It never moved, never made a sound, but its presence was unnerving. Claire began to feel uneasy in her own home, constantly checking the windows, expecting to see the shadow lurking outside. One night, she decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, she went outside to the spot where the figure always appeared. But there was nothing there. Confused, she turned to go back inside, only to see the shadow standing at the window, looking out at her. Panic gripped her. She ran inside, heart racing, but when she checked the window, the figure was gone. That night, she barely slept, and the next morning, she contacted the previous owner of the house. They told her a chilling tale. Decades ago, a man had been found dead in that very spot, staring up at the house. His cause of death was never determined, but some say his spirit still wanders, trapped between the living and the dead, waiting for someone to notice him. From that night on, Claire never looked out the window after dark. But the feeling of being watched never left her. In a small town, there was an old, decrepit hotel that had long since fallen out of use. The Moonlight Inn was notorious for one room in particular, room 13. For years, strange stories had circulated about this room. Guests would hear footsteps, whispering, and doors opening and closing on their own. Those who stayed in room 13 often left in the middle of the night, never to return. Henry, a skeptic and paranormal investigator, decided to spend the night there to debunk the rumors. He checked into the hotel, securing room 13 with a sense of defiance. The hotel staff were uneasy but said nothing, simply handing him the key with a grave look. At first, everything seemed normal. The room was musty, old, but nothing out of the ordinary. As the night wore on, however, Henry began to feel a heavy presence, as if the air had thickened. The silence in the room was oppressive, almost tangible. He set up his recording equipment and waited. Around midnight, it began. The door creaked open, though no one was there. A soft shuffle, like footsteps, moved across the floor. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, and Henry could see his breath fogging in the air. The silence grew louder, pressing against his ears until it was unbearable. Suddenly, his camera malfunctioned, and his flashlight flickered out. In the pitch black, Henry heard something, a voice, low and raspy. "Why are you here?" it whispered. Henry froze. The voice grew louder, repeating the question over and over. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with malice. His heart raced as the voice grew into a scream, deafening, overwhelming, as if the very room was alive with anger. In a blind panic, Henry grabbed his things and fled. When he reviewed the footage the next day, all he could hear was silence, except for the moment the door opened. Then, faintly, unmistakably, he heard the voice, "Why are you here?" He never returned to the Moonlight Inn, and to this day, room 13 remains unoccupied, its door forever closed. These stories capture the essence of Tales from the Shadows, with suspenseful and eerie themes.